hear there's fighting at the castle now, the merchant told George, nervously working his knife into the food on his plate. George shrugged and took another bite. And so what if they are? There's 6,000 Spaniards at most out there, and we've got what, double that, easily? Including the townsfolk. The merchant swallowed, even though he wasn't taking a bite. George gave him his best reassuring smile and leaned forward. They're outnumbered, and they're attacking. Sieges always favor the defense. Don't worry about it. Now, how's business? The merchant shot him a look. Fair enough. They hadn't let George out of the English house either. Not that he particularly wanted to. They were under the protection of the Spanish king in here, and unlike the merchants that made up most of his companions, he wasn't missing out on any business opportunities by staying inside. George sighed and leaned back. He hadn't been allowed to leave Antwerp for 12 days now, what with the Spanish forces still holding the town castle, and more troops joining to attack the city. But that's what war was. A lot of sitting around waiting. Waiting to get to the fight. Waiting for the fight to start. And waiting to be released from prison after you had been captured by the enemy. George shook his head and let his thoughts wander to more pleasant topics. Perhaps you've at least been able to meet some new associates while here. He tried again, but before his counterpart could answer, a servant came into the room bringing more wine. The merchant's eyes darted eagerly to the thin man. The words on his lips ere his mind had time to formulate them. Any news of the battle? The thin man shifted uncomfortably and stepped forward to fill his cup. They say the fog is so thick you can't even see the houses anymore. It made the merchant shift, just like the servant just had. George leaned forward again. I saw those trenches myself yesterday. They're tall. They'll hold. He leaned back and started picking at a sprout on his plate. And it's more of a skirmish from what I've heard. His counterpart let out a long, shaky breath as the servant left the room. Well, you are the soldier, Master Gascoigne. George snorted and shook his head. Not for long, my friend. Not for long. As soon as this is all over, I'm back to England. A friend of mine says he may be able to make some introductions for me. Introductions? It's not easy to live off being a poet without a patron. Speaking of which, how is your uncle these days? That finally made the man laugh, and George settled into his chair to spend the evening joking of London and not thinking about the fighting that was going on outside. This wasn't his war. Not anymore. He almost succeeded. It was near the end of their dinner. They had gotten to thinking of where one might still find tobacco in town, when the servant burst into the room again. Masters, He swallowed. They say the Spanish are going to take the trenches. May I leave? George stood up. Beside him, the merchant had paled. Go to your rooms. You'll be safe there, George said. What followed was chairs screeching on the floor and a plate falling to the ground, but George was already on his way to the staircase. With long, jumping strides, he ran up the tower to the roof, where he found the night sky lit red. Fires were burning in the city all around the castle yard. Inwardly cursing himself, he hurried down the stairs, grabbing his cloak and sword, and burst out onto the street. Chaos greeted him. 30 soldiers running past him, away from the fight, fear in their eyes. Townsmen passing what weapons they could find out amongst themselves, shouting of where to go and make their stand. George clenched his fists and went off towards the sounds of battle. Everywhere, men were getting ready to die. Panicked soldiers fled towards him, faces covered in sudden blood. Fathers and mothers pushed past, pulling their confused children along to get them to the safety of the nearest church. A trumpeter on horseback crashed into the street from a side alley, sword drawn, cursing and screaming at the men to follow him back to the fight. A crowd of them cheered back and ran after him into the smoke. George looked at them, but before he could make a decision, shouts arose from his left. Even while turning, he felt the crash of bodies into his side, felt himself being thrown to the ground. And then there were just boots, stomping left and right on top of him. Instinctively, he curled up, hoping a stray kick wouldn't knock him unconscious. When they had finally passed, George placed a shaking hand to the dirt, groaning to get back up. That was going to make for some unnecessary bruises. Why on earth had he wanted to come out here? What stupid sense of being able to help had driven him to do this again? Before he could find an answer, something struck the door beside him. George turned. That was a bullet hole. He spun back, cursing, seeing the shadows approaching through the smoke towards him, and ran. When he got back to the English house, he was greeted with open gates. Open gates? What was the governor thinking? He stormed right into the entryway where the man was standing, surrounded by the stricken merchants, desperate for any form of good news. Why the bloody hell are the doors still open? There's a bloody war happening out there. Well, what will you have me do, Master Gascoigne? Came the exasperated response from the old man, who was clearly about to lecture him and everyone else in the room about something, but George just kept on walking towards him until he was right in his face. You don't understand, sire. This isn't a battle anymore. This is a sack. Those Spanish soldiers haven't been paid for weeks, and when they finally take the city, they are going to go into every house, every shop, and take what they believe is theirs. So unless you think their king will have given them their salaries before they reach the English house, you need to close the gate and muster your guards, because they will come for you. 3 minutes later, George was striding towards the gate, key in hand, a frightened group of merchants enlisted as his help in tow. But before he could reach it, he heard the sound of boots and shouts out on the street. George couldn't speak Spanish, but he'd heard enough to immediately recognize it. "Quick!" he shouted, sprinting to the gate, already seeing the Spaniard's face swivel towards him from the other side. Shots rang out as he jumped behind the door, pushing on it, ramming the key in and turning, hoping it wasn't too late or that the crash came the sound of the Spaniard's breastplates clattering against the shut gate. George heaved a sigh of relief and leaned against the wall. But when he turned to smile to his compatriots, he found them all staring at his friend from dinner, who was lying on the ground, blood streaming from his head. Believe it or not, that man made a full recovery. But George had been right about the sack. Over the next few days, Spanish troops looted, raped, and murdered their way through Antwerp. When George was finally able to leave 8 days later, the bodies of men, women, and children littered the streets, the stench of their corpses mixing with the smoke from the burnt buildings of what had once been a center of trade and commerce in the Netherlands. On his way back to England, George would write down what he had experienced over the past few days. When published, his account would help spread the news of what would go down in history as the Spanish Fury at Antwerp. Antwerp was not the only Spanish Fury, but it was the most impactful. Up until then, the insurrection that was taking place in the Netherlands had largely been contained to the northern provinces of Holland and Zeeland. Now, almost all of the provinces of what was then known as the Habsburg Netherlands rose in revolt against its Spanish king, demanding the expulsion of all foreign troops, the suspension of persecution against Protestants, and the consultation of the States General in the governance of the realm. It marked the beginning of a struggle that would last over 80 years, and eventually see the birth of an independent country called the Republic of the Seven United Netherlands, also known as the United Provinces of the Netherlands, but most commonly referred to simply as the Dutch Republic. There's just one problem. Antwerp isn't in the Netherlands. The answer to how a city whose plight became foundational to the ideas which led a group of people towards independence could not be in the country that group claimed as their own lies in the construction of their identity, in the construction of a new answer to that old question, whose land is this land? Part 2. The Netherlands. The exact amount of people who died in the Spanish Fury at Antwerp may never be established. Historians differ in their estimates, but they all begin at around 7,000 dead. What everyone can agree on is the guilty party behind the attack, the employer of the soldiers, Philip II of Habsburg, King of Spain and feudal overlord of the feudal lands and provinces, which by that point were collectively known as the Habsburg Netherlands. Philip had gone bankrupt the year before, and his soldiers hadn't been paid since. Frustrated, angry, and running out of financial options, the soldiers decided to take what they saw as rightfully theirs. After all, the people of the Netherlands were who they had been brought here to fight. By that point, the people of the Netherlands had been in revolt against their Spanish lord for over a decade. They would continue to do so for another 72 years. This story, this 80-year tale of resistance against what was then the most powerful dynasty in all of Europe, became the foundational myth for the country we today call the Netherlands, a country which looks a lot like so many other European nation-states, where Dutch is the official language and almost 3/4 of the population identify as ethnically Dutch, the remainder mostly recent immigrants from across the world. But the story I'm going to tell you today is not one of an ethnic group fighting for freedom from their imperial overlords, whose struggle for independence culminated in the establishment of a state for their nation. What I'm going to argue is that it was this struggle, the war for independence, which did not even start out as a war for independence, which created the nation, or nationality, which we would today call the Dutch. If one were to have visited the Low Countries in the 16th century, one would not have been met with a single state calling itself the Habsburg Netherlands. The Habsburgs ruled a variety of counties, duchies, and lordships, which were all part of the larger political framework of the Holy Roman Empire. These political entities had found themselves part of a multitude of dynastic constellations over the course of the past centuries. The most important of these for us was the territorial conglomerate stitched together first by the Dukes of Burgundy, and later, after their line ended, the expansion of this conglomerate under the leadership of the House of Habsburg. But we should not think of this conglomerate as a state in the modern sense. These were separate political entities, stitched together by the simple fact that they were ruled by the same monarch. The Burgundians and the Habsburgs did try to foster political integration among their provinces, but this was broadly limited to several councils, the most important of which was the Council of State, but which didn't have the power to enforce much. The other element of political integration they managed to create was an institution called the States General, which met in Brussels and had the power to vote on the provision of extraordinary subsidies for the sovereign, but again had no real executive or legislative power. What the individual provinces did share was a long-established spirit of autonomy and a jealous protection of provincial, urban, communal, guild, and estate liberties and privileges. In other words, each province was more concerned with looking after its own interests than looking after the interests of the Habsburg Netherlands as a whole. However, if these interests were threatened by their feudal overlords, the provinces didn't shy away from rising up against them in protest. For example, the great cities of Flanders, Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres had a long history of revolting against central authority. In the 14th century, the Flemish cities challenged the French crown in several large-scale wars, and more recently, from 1482 to 1492, the Flemish cities, joined by some factions in Brabant and Holland, had revolted twice against Philip's great-grandfather Maximilian. The Dutch Revolt was, as a matter of fact, not at all an unprecedented historical occurrence. Now, there is another thing that these politically pretty independent provinces had in common. The Low Countries were, by 1566, one of the most populous, prosperous, and economically dynamic regions in Europe. While Burgundian and Habsburg rule had failed to mold the provinces into a new unitary state, it had greatly facilitated commercial and financial ties among them. But other than that, the similarities, the potential factors which could lay the foundation for a shared sense of identity, weren't exactly large. In the south of the Habsburg Netherlands, the language spoken was the Walloon dialect of French. In the center and north of the territory it was Dutch, with the notable exception of West Friesland, where Frisian was spoken. From 1530 onwards, the Reformation began to make major inroads in the northern provinces, mostly in the form of the Calvinist Reformed edition of Protestantism. In the south, meanwhile, Catholicism remained the religious mainstay. Okay, so this is the political, linguistic, and religious context in which the Dutch Revolt begins. But why did it begin? The initial impetus was both political and religious. While Philip's predecessor and father Charles V had continued his forebears' attempts to centralize the political system, as well as raised heavy taxes and introduced laws against heresy, he managed to maintain a balance of power between local authorities, provincial states, and the central government, which was seen as more equitable. Religious persecution, too, had lessened in the final decades of his reign. Moreover, Charles, who himself had been born in Ghent, was perceived as a native ruler who was sympathetic to the interests of the various provinces of the Habsburg Netherlands. Philip, on the other hand, was born and raised in Spain and spoke neither Dutch nor French. Basically, he was seen as a foreigner. Likewise, in contrast to the policies of his father, Philip appointed a number of nobles from outside the Netherlands to the Council of State, most notably the Burgundian Cardinal Antoine Perrenot de Granvelle, who quickly gained significant influence at the expense of native councillors. To this were added Philip's counter-Reformation religious policies, the reorganization of the Church in the Netherlands and its subordination to Granvelle, the rejuvenation of the Netherlandish Inquisition, and the intensified persecution of Protestants, as well as more heavy taxes. All this alienated large segments of society. In 1561, a group of influential Netherlandish nobles, including one William of Orange, formed a league against Granvelle and the religious and tax policies of the Spanish crown, withdrawing themselves from the Council of State. Now, Granvelle was recalled in 1564, but the efforts of these Netherlandish nobles to obtain any moderation of the anti-heresy laws were unsuccessful. Despite the efforts of Margaret of Parma, Philip's half-sister and regent of the Habsburg Netherlands, to achieve a compromise in the face of mounting religious unrest, Philip ultimately refused to moderate his stance. Then, in the summer of 1566, after years of turmoil and protest, a wave of iconoclastic violence erupted through the provinces, resulting in the mass destruction of Catholic church property and religious art. Margaret of Parma and her court were completely overwhelmed and appealed to Philip for help. But at this point, I want to note that, with the exception of Protestantism, none of this was new. The Habsburg Netherlands had seen revolts motivated for pretty much the same reasons in the past, and in the beginning, the Dutch Revolt was no different than these. Also, notice how I used the term Dutch Revolt instead of 80 Years' War, because that's what it was in the beginning. It didn't start out as a war of independence. All that the inhabitants of the Netherlands wanted was their autonomy back. In fact, it was only after 13 years of war that the 7 northern provinces chose a path that would lead them to independence. In 1567, a year after the revolt had sprung up in Philip's northern European territory, the Spanish monarch sent the Castilian nobleman Fernando Alvarez de Toledo, the Duke of Alba, with 10,000 men to the Netherlands. Alba was a highly experienced and competent general and diplomat who had held several important positions during the reign of Charles V. His mission was to quash the rebellion and ensure stability in the region. Alba, however, did a poor job of enamoring himself to the locals. Replacing Margaret of Parma as Governor-General, he established a special tribunal to punish those responsible for the riots. Officially, it was called the Council of Troubles. Soon, however, it came to be known by another name, the Council of Blood. Over the course of 5 years, it would execute more than 5,000 people. And, on top of all this, in order to meet the substantial costs of maintaining his 10,000-man-strong army, the Duke imposed additional taxes on the population, which some cities now refused to pay. And this all came on top of the taxes which Philip II had imposed, which the local population wasn't too fond of either, especially his 10% sales tax. For a region whose wealth depended on trade, this represented a huge blow to their income. In the end, Alba had to force them to pay these taxes. Now, at this point, not all provinces were in open rebellion against Philip, but the stadtholders, or governors, of the provinces of Artois, Flanders, and Brabant protested against the decision to physically enforce taxation at Philip's court. Even though Philip finally relented and the most egregious taxes weren't collected, it led to further tensions between the provincial authorities and the Spanish central government. Other politicians tried to convince Alba to withdraw the new tax completely, which he did in 1572, but by then it was too late. Popular discontent, or even anger, towards what were increasingly being seen as occupying Spanish forces had only grown, and by spring 1572 rebel forces were in a position to strike back. Under the leadership of William of Orange, the aforementioned Dutch nobleman and stadtholder of the provinces of Zeeland and Holland, rebel forces managed to capture via amphibious assault the port town of Brill, a beachhead which allowed them to make inroads into Habsburg-held territory. But despite achieving these military victories, rebellion had not become a consensus among the population. Amsterdam, the biggest city in Holland, was still loyal to the Spanish king. Nor were the rebels seeking independence at this point. See, at this point, Dutch propaganda wasn't focusing on the King of Spain, but on the man who had introduced these oppressive policies, the Duke of Alba. The rebellion's demands still were confining themselves to the assurances for religious liberty and financial autonomy. Spanish Habsburg forces, however, had no intention to negotiate. Starting in 1573, they went on the counteroffensive, pushing the rebels back north, besieging cities such as Leiden and Antwerp. And when they broke the sieges, well, things like the fury at Antwerp were the consequence. Faced with the abject horror of the wanton destruction of the occupying forces, ever more people were pushed to side with the resistance. Events like these made the Dutch endure, pushed them to keep fighting to free themselves from these perceived aggressors, so that things like this could never happen again to their cities. Right? Because remember, Antwerp isn't in the Netherlands. If you look on a map, you'll see it's in Belgium. So what's really going on here? We need to take a step back. From 1576 to 1579, all of the provinces of the Spanish Netherlands, with the notable exception of Luxembourg, were in open revolt against the Spanish crown. In the aftermath of the sack of Antwerp, seen as the horrific climax of years of pillaging and violence perpetrated by Spanish troops, the States General, having already convened earlier that year, ratified an agreement between all of the provinces, including Holland and Zeeland, in which they collectively pledged to rid their lands of the marauding Spanish troops and re-establish the public peace. The agreement was thus both a peace treaty and a defensive alliance. This action was couched in established laws and precedent. At the time, there was no royal governor-general in the Netherlands, and so the States General simply assumed the authority to raise taxes and troops from the provinces for their collective defense. Now, it's important to note that while this treaty, known as the Pacification of Ghent, explicitly blamed the Spanish government in Brussels for the war, the provinces still didn't renounce their allegiance to the Spanish king. What the signatories of the pacification promised was to return their lands to the hands of the king when the violence was suppressed. In the Wilhelmus, a Dutch patriotic song about the rebel leader William of Orange, which later became the national anthem of the Netherlands, the lyrics emphasize William's personal loyalty to the Spanish king and how his actions are directed against Philip's wicked counselors in the Netherlands. But at the same time, getting rid of the foreign soldiers was one of the only things which united all of these provinces. While they proclaimed a general amnesty revoking the anti-heresy measures enacted by the Duke of Alba, the resolution of the fundamental issues which started the revolt was postponed until after the re-establishment of the peace. This proved to be the pacification of Ghent's ultimate undoing, and the beginnings of a permanent split between the provinces of the Netherlands. Once the Spanish soldiers had departed and a new governor-general, Philip's half-brother Don Juan of Austria, had arrived, the common ground began to crumble. Don Juan nominally agreed to all of the provisions of the pacification, but soon launched an offensive against the still reluctant northern provinces. At the same time, however, he and his successor, the Duke of Parma, continued to negotiate, hoping to entice more loyalist provinces to resubmit to Habsburg authority. The States General once again attempted to reaffirm the unity of the provinces with the Union of Brussels in 1577, but Spanish military success and religious tensions, specifically the opposition of Catholics in the southern provinces to Calvinist coups in various cities, were undermining these efforts. Then, in 1579, the counties of Artois and Hainaut, as well as the burgraviettes of Lille, Douai, and Orchies, signed the Union of Arras, in which they fully returned to the Spanish fold. Namur, Luxembourg, and Limburg would eventually join them. Under the provisions of this union, the provinces and the Spanish crown essentially agreed to return to the status quo as it had been under Charles V, reinstating old privileges and autonomy and abolishing the more recent taxes. Plus, Catholicism was reconfirmed as the sole legal religion. You can probably see where this is going. Later that year, most of the remaining provinces formed the Union of Utrecht, reaffirming their commitment to religious tolerance and the unity established at Brussels. Each of the two unions then formed its own States General. But, despite all of this, the Union of Utrecht still technically recognized Spanish suzerainty, at least for now. Continuing hostilities only further exacerbated the already frayed relationship between the Union of Utrecht and the king. In 1580, Philip outlawed William of Orange, and the Union began making inquiries if any Protestant monarchs wanted to become their ruler instead. Finally, in 1581, the States General of the Union of Utrecht issued the Act of Abjuration, formally absolving all magistrates from their oath of allegiance to the Spanish crown. In other words, they declared independence. And, having been unable to find a monarch willing to take them under his protection, they proclaimed themselves a republic. And this is the political entity which became known as the Dutch Republic. After the Union of Utrecht, the ideological justifications for the revolt began to shift. As I've pointed out to you many times, up until now the leaders of the revolt had legitimated their actions by claiming to be acting on behalf of the king and his legitimate authority. They weren't rebels or outlaws, but were simply fighting for the king's peace and the privileges and freedoms entitled to them by law and right. Philip was deliberately shielded from direct criticism. Now, however, propagandists began to take direct aim at the monarch himself. A 1579 tract argued that the state's traditional obligations to maintain law and order and protect the populace from violence and oppression permitted them to confront their ruler, especially when issues of conscience, in this case, read religion, were at stake. In 1580, William of Orange published the Apology, a sort of letter of justification which was published in 5 languages and circulated internationally, which specifically blamed Philip's tyrannical policies for the war. For good measure, William also directly attacked the character of the king, accusing him of parricide, murder, adultery, and incest. Now, the Union of Utrecht theoretically encompassed most of the Netherlands, but the 7 provinces of Groningen, Friesland, Overijssel, Guelders, Utrecht, Holland, and Zeeland ultimately formed the basis of the independent Dutch Republic. All of Flanders and most of Brabant, including Antwerp, which actually served as the capital of the Union for the first 5 years of its existence, were conquered by the Spanish in the 1580s. The war, of course, continued for almost another 70 years, and, of course, the front lines moved many times depending on the efficacy of individual military campaigns, the impact of international events, and were often just based on the geography of the area. And so it happened that when the war officially ended and a peace treaty was signed at Münster in 1648, Antwerp, the initial capital of the Republic, came to lie outside its borders. It should also be noted that this division wasn't a linguistic one. Up until today, people in the north of Belgium, a region now called Flanders, the region where Antwerp lies, speak a dialect of Dutch, Flemish. So, that's how the Low Countries came to be split in 2. Not along ethnic lines or strictly religious lines, but along the front lines of a battlefield that changed over the course of not just the 8 Years' War, but the many subsequent conflicts that followed in its European history. And I also need to make a second point right now. Well, to a large extent, the conflict between Spain and the rebel provinces in the Netherlands created the Dutch Republic. To an equally large extent, it was the Republic which created the Dutch. As we've already seen, the Dutch rebels in the Netherlands after 1566 did not revolt to establish a unified republican nation-state based on a uniform Dutch Calvinist national identity. In fact, the Dutch Republic of the 1580s possessed neither a monolithic religious or cultural identity, nor unitary political structure. The Reformed faith was certainly the most popular religion, and was the privileged church and government and society, but the Union of Utrecht specified that everyone is entitled to his or her personal beliefs. Though the public display of dissenting faiths, especially Catholicism, was often persecuted, this personal religious freedom was a major factor behind the immigration of religious refugees from all over Europe to the Republic. Despite the revolutionary character of the Dutch Republic touted by contemporary propagandists and some subsequent historians, the political system of the Dutch Republic was characterized more by continuity with the medieval past than any forward-looking innovation. After all, the provinces of the Habsburg Netherlands had revolted in the first place to defend the autonomy, liberties, and privileges that they had enjoyed in the past. In the Dutch Republic, each of these provinces still wanted to keep as much autonomy as it could. The result was that the Dutch Republic became essentially a confederation of 7 autonomous provinces that were largely self-governed, more or less as they had been before Philip II attempted to centralize government in Brussels. The only common political institution was the States General, another institution carried over from pre-revolt times. Now, different to its predecessor, it had the authority to conduct something like, for example, external affairs, as the government of a federal system would, but aside from this, its competences were still extremely limited. I mean, it worked based on unanimity voting, and technically, each of the 7 provinces even had its own stadtholder. They just agreed to all vote for the same person so that they would have a single commander in case of emergencies, for example, war. Throughout much of its existence, the Dutch Republic technically didn't even have a unified army or navy. For all intents and purposes, the Dutch Republic was a union of 7 separate sovereign republics. But However unplanned the results of the 80 Years' War were, they would shape the way the Dutch saw themselves and thought about politics. The fundamental fault line in the politics of the Dutch Republic was between the Orangists, who supported a stronger executive power in the person of the stadholder, a position which would eventually evolve into a hereditary, quasi-monarchical office of the House of Orange, and the States Party, those of a more republican inclination who advocated for a stronger States General. Both of these factions legitimated their political arguments using the experiences of the 80 Years' War. They simply drew opposite conclusions from them. In this context, writing history became politically charged. So, let's delve back into the historiography. The exigencies of waging what had started out as a civil war and then slowly morphed into a war for independence against the Spanish monarchy as a composite republican polity, especially in the intellectual and media environment of the 16th and 17th centuries, both necessitated and promoted the formation of identity narratives that sustained and shaped the Dutch Republic throughout the war for independence and beyond. You probably won't be surprised to hear that the historiography of the 80 Years' War is, even by the standards of the early modern period, extraordinarily complicated and controversial, not least of all because scholars began writing the history of the Dutch Revolt while the conflict was still ongoing. This was especially the case because, since its very beginning, the Dutch Revolt had been a conflict of international significance and transnational dimensions. The conflict was a focal point for the European Reformation as well as European great power politics, which meant that powerful individuals throughout Europe had an interest in the conflict and the narrative surrounding it. Of course, the intellectuals of the young Dutch Republic had especially pressing motivations for establishing a coherent and convincing argument to justify both their rebellion against the Spanish crown and the political structure of their fledgling polity. Despite what I had just told you earlier, at the time, most proponents and opponents of the revolt saw it as a decisive break with the past, and over the course of the decades-long conflict, generations of Dutch scholars would labor to substantiate the legitimacy of their state and struggle. One of the first places in which Dutch historians went looking for legitimacy was antiquity. Now, this in and of itself was only made possible by the rediscovery a few decades earlier of Roman author Tacitus's Germania, an ethnographic and historical account of the German tribes living in the north of the Roman Empire around the turn of the 1st century AD. Humanists in the Netherlands zeroed in on the Batavi, a Germanic tribe from what later became the Low Countries, who according to Tacitus instigated a large-scale revolt against the Roman Empire in AD 69 and subsequently scored several impressive victories over the vaunted Roman legions. In the context of the Dutch Revolt, I think we can all see where this is going. Earlier writers had already posited a mythological identification between the ancient Batavians and the contemporary people of the Netherlands. During the 80 Years' War, this narrative achieved even greater prominence in the works of Dutch authors and artists. In 1588, Hadrianus Junius, the official historian of the States of Holland, published the Batavian, in which he explicitly identified Holland as the ancient homeland of the Batavians and drew a direct connection between the virtue of this ancient tribe and that of the people of Holland. Probably the most famous rendition of this Batavian myth was Hugo Grotius's Treatise of the Antiquity of the Batavian, now Hollandish Republic, published in 1610. While ostensibly dealing with ancient history, Grotius's work was very clearly just as concerned with contemporary issues. Grotius claimed that the ancient Batavians had organized their society as an aristocratic republic of elected representatives, an argument that firmly rooted not only the sovereign power of the States of Holland, but also a republican form of government and historical precedent. Furthermore, according to Grotius, the ancient Batavians were a proud people who valued freedom, specifically freedom in the form of consensual government, above all else. They had valiantly fought to free themselves from Roman tyranny and had now supposedly passed down these values and practices through the ages to their Dutch descendants. According to Grotius, the Dutch Revolt was thus not a gross violation of monarchical legitimacy or law. Rather, it was a continuation of the Dutch people's long-established tradition of political and personal freedom. In other words, the tables were turned. It was not the Dutch rebels violating ancient law and custom, but the despotic Spanish crown. As a foundational national mythology, the Batavian myth continued to hold great significance in the Dutch Republic, especially in the intellectual and artistic spheres, until the early 19th century. The sister republic, established by revolutionary France and the Netherlands in 1795, was officially named the Batavian Republic, a clear attempt to connect this well-established national myth with the ideology of the French Revolution. the political and military context of the early 17th century exercised a massive influence on the increasingly prodigious publication of historical works in the Dutch Republic. In particular, political debates within the Dutch Republic surrounding the 12 Years' Truce with Spain, which started in 1609, provided concrete motivations for the construction of particular historical narratives. Historical pamphlets intended for a mass audience, such as the anonymously published The Freedom of the Netherlands and the Churches, On Spain and Rome's Tyranny from 1610, utilized a simplified sequence of historical episodes to construct a straightforward, vehemently anti-Spanish narrative of the previous 44 years of the conflict. This approach, labeled by the historian Jan Romein as a, quote, parade of easily recognizable events, was distributed to the public in a variety of media forms, highlighting the worst Spanish abuses and atrocities to remind the Dutch population of the many just reasons for their struggle and of the treacherous nature of their enemy. This episodic historical canon, focusing above all on the oppression of the Duke of Alba's regime and the Spanish Furies, became something of a standard type of popular histories in the early decades of the century. Willem Baudartius, a reformed clergyman and avowed opponent of the truce with Spain, wrote an influential popular history, notably structured in the form of a dialogue between a, quote, free Netherlander and a, quote, Hispanicized Netherlander. In this polemic, the free Netherlander recounts to his compatriot the manifold crimes of the Spanish in grisly detail, asserting that, quote, never has any other cruel tyrant more disgracefully sought or tried to subvert his subjects, exterminate them, and wipe them out as the King of Spain and his deputies have now done for many years, inspired and incited by the accursed Papal Inquisition chamber, in which already from the times of Emperor Charles V, numerous placards have been crafted, due to which in the reign of this emperor 50,000 people were beheaded, drowned, hung, buried alive, burnt, and killed in other ways. End quote. This tract, later revised into a widely popular children's book, exemplifies the increasing trend in contemporary Dutch media of juxtaposing the supposed virtues of the Dutch people, bravery, determination, love of freedom, tolerance, and self-sacrifice, with the supposed vices of the Spanish enemy: cruelty, avarice, intolerance, violence, despotism. And one other important thing to note is that this vilification of the Spanish wasn't just meant to win the sympathy and support of foreign observers. I mean, how could it in something like a Dutch children's book? It functioned as a way for the Dutch to conceptualize who they were, the opposite in character to the Spanish. But this narrative wasn't just limited to children's books and pamphlets. In prose, poetry, songs, paintings, engravings, and other media, a standardized version of the evil Spanish was created, which in turn defined and popularized a national identity rooted in a great extent to this moral opposition. By the 1630s, both elite and popular historical media had constructed and communicated a cohesive conception of the 80 Years' War that became a foundational narrative for the Dutch Republic. It was this sense of shared experience which provided the citizens of the Dutch Republic with the foundations for imagining a Dutch community, one which didn't replace local and provincial identities, but rather created a new level of shared community on top of them. If you came from the city of Amsterdam in the province of Holland, you could now not only identify as an Amsterdammer and a Hollander, but also as a Dutchman. For the Dutch Republic after 1648, the 80 Years' War held a significance comparable to that of the American Revolution for the contemporary United States. It became the authoritative frame of reference, a source of legitimacy and authority, with which all subsequent experiences and issues would be compared, even if it was invoked in support of contradictory political oppositions. Remember what I said about Dutch politics post-war being split about what to do with the powerful House of Orange? Well, for the stadtholders of the House of Orange, the history and legacy of the war presented both an indispensable source of authority and legitimacy, as well as a potentially existential threat to this authority and legitimacy. On the one hand, the dynasty has supplied some of the conflict's most notable political and military leaders, whose wartime achievements were the foundation of its prestige and claims to leadership. On the other, the nature of the war is a revolt against monarchical rule in support of provincial autonomies, as well as the nature of the Dutch state as a republic, put the House of Orange, with its quasi-monarchical claims to leadership of the Netherlands and clearly dynastic aspirations for the stadtholderate, in a decidedly awkward position. In other words, it's difficult to argue the dynastic principle when your claim to power is leadership in overthrowing the previous dynasty. In the political disputes of the subsequent decades between the Orangists and the States Party, both factions invoked the common foundational narrative of the war to argue their opposing viewpoints. Orangist partisans emphasized the moral and military leadership of the Princes of Orange during the war. In stark contrast, propagandists of the States Party made use of the struggle for independence from Spain to reaffirm the state's republican constitution. It was a political struggle which was to continue within the Dutch Republic until it was defeated and abolished in the wars following the French Revolution. But, while all of this was happening in the Dutch Republic, something similar, yet very different, was going on in those provinces which had signed the Union of Arras and remained under Spanish Habsburg rule. During the course of the 80 Years' War, a radically different narrative of the conflict emerged in the southern Netherlands. Much like in the north, public discussion and memory of the war was greatly influenced by political considerations. In the early years of the revolt, the Spanish authorities under the Duke of Alba forcibly suppressed discourse surrounding recent events, and after the Spanish reconquests of the 1580s, reconciliation treaties with local governments forbade public commemoration or discussion of the revolts. Many in the Spanish Netherlands had also a vested interest in forgiving and forgetting. So many people were implicated in some way or another that in the interests of societal cohesion, it was easier to just pretend nothing had happened. Unfortunately, this was not a feasible long-term solution. The war went on, and much of it was fought outside of the northern provinces. Much like their enemies, the Habsburg authorities found it necessary to promote a legitimizing narrative to sustain public loyalty and commitment to the war effort. The propagandists of the monarchy quickly developed a coherent and consistent loyalist interpretation of the revolt. In 1587, the Catholic polemicist Richard Verstagen published the strikingly titled Theatre of Cruelties of Heretics in Our Time, which described the iconoclastic violence of the Dutch Protestants in graphic detail. In that same year, the historian Florentinus van der Heer released his De Initiis Tumultum Belgicorum, which was the first coherent and sequential history of the revolt written by a native Netherlander. Dedicated to Alexander Farnese, the Duke of Parma, van der Heer's work was influential in both the northern and southern provinces. His history, however, only covered the origins of the revolt up to the arrival of the Duke of Alba in 1567. Correspondingly, his analysis focused on the iconoclasm in 1566 and the errors of the rebels. Van der Heer's work established the enduring basis of the southern Netherlandish narrative of the revolt, in which the conflict was the result of firstly ambitious, scheming nobles like William of Orange, secondly opposition to ecclesiastical reorganization, and thirdly, above all else, heresy. To a much greater extent than their northern counterparts, the 80 Years' War was a war of religion for the Catholics of the southern Netherlands. Popular historical narratives, which were encouraged by the Habsburg dynasty, portrayed the conflict as a struggle for the preservation of the true faith against the evil forces of heresy that sought to physically destroy the Catholic Church and its members. Here, the traditional claims of the Habsburg dynasty to exceptional piety and defense of the Church were strongly emphasized and seemingly vindicated by the decades-long defense against Republican forces. The experience of the 80 Years' War and subsequent decades of defensive conflicts against French King Louis XIV solidified the legitimacy of the Habsburg in the southern Netherlands as defenders of the faith and, ironically enough, of local privileges and autonomy against the centralist French state. In other words, it was the Catholic Church and the Habsburg dynasty which were the center of the historical narrative in the south, which stressed continuity with the supposedly peaceful and prosperous pre-1566 era. These two divergent narratives on the Dutch Revolt persisted into the 19th century, the time of the advent of nationalism and the development of the modern academic discipline of history. These two combined factors stimulated both a renewed interest in and a revived debate around the Dutch Revolt. After the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Habsburgs relinquished control of the southern Netherlands and instead gave them to the House of Orange for them to rule in what was officially called the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. However, tensions between the North and the South around religious differences, taxation, and political representation rose steadily over the 16 years of the state's existence, and finally boiled over in what became known as the Belgian Revolution of 1830, which established the modern independent state of Belgium. It was now up to Belgian nationalist historians to prove that their political entity, which was made up of both French and Dutch speakers, or rather Walloon and Flemish speakers, was more than historical happenstance, but meant to be. The most famous and influential of these was by the Belgian historian Henri Pirenne In his Histoire de la Belgique, Perrin denied that multi-ethnic Belgium was a historical accident, a mere leftover of the Dutch Revolt. He traced the existence of a unified Belgian civilization back to antiquity, just like the Dutch historians had a couple of centuries before him, arguing that in a social, political, as well as ethnic sense, both Flemings and Walloons were one nation. In particular, he emphasized how the bonds of tradition and commerce had linked the Netherlands provinces under the Burgundian state, which Perrin saw as a direct predecessor of modern Belgium, and continued to unite them after the upheaval of the Dutch Revolt. For Perrin, Belgium had always been a cosmopolitan society at the intersection of Germanic and Latin Europe. But I'm getting off track here. What I've been trying to say to you, is that the Netherlands, as the nation-state that we know it today, was created by its war for independence. That's why the city of Antwerp, despite offering one of the main motivators for so many Netherlanders to join in the fight against their feudal lord, can today be outside of the Netherlands. It's simply about which army controlled the city after the war was over. In order to make sense of all of this, historians and politicians and laypeople then wrote histories of their country in order to justify its existence. And in doing so, they increasingly began to create a common sense of identity on the basis of these shared experiences. George Gascoigne's account of the sack of Antwerp is a prime example of this. Now, you might think, but wait, he's not Dutch, he was an Englishman. And you'd be right. But George Gascoigne didn't actually write most of that pamphlet. The Dutch historian Raymond Vagel recently discovered that Gascoigne copied most of his account from a Dutch pamphlet. Everything he wrote about going onto the street, taken from that other text, whose original purpose was to show other Netherlanders how terrible the Spanish were. Even though this wasn't the text's original intention, this narrative would lay the foundation for Dutch identity, even though it ultimately wasn't applied in the city it talks about. And yeah, that's our show for this week. And if I've just shocked or confused you with that last bit of news now, well, then let's take it as a lesson. Perhaps our need to make sense of things, to look for narratives, blinds us to the possibility that someone may be constructing them with a purpose in mind. This podcast was written and researched by Carolina Lebzelter and Ian Jones. It was recorded and edited by me, Coleman Marshik. The music was composed by Matthias Cantini, and all artwork was designed by Andrew Holt.